The other thing I'll point out is something called social transition. So, social transition is where a child or an adult decides to start living as the opposite sex. So, dressing like, telling people a different name, using different pronouns, and social transition has been often, been said to be a harmless way of starting off, right? That if you are socially transitioning, and I've also thought this, I'm curious to actually have this conversation with you, because to me it seems like if you tell somebody that they can say that they're a male and use a male pronoun, you can tell a young girl this, right? It seems like they may never decide to go on hormones or have surgery. They might just kind of try it out and then decide they don't like it. But you think that it's very predictive of these other bad downstream effects.
Oh, it's not just me who thinks it, it's the data shows it. So
Mhm.
in the time before puberty suppression, you socially transitioning a child was very, very uncommon. I don't even know that anyone ever did it, because you can't socially transition a kid, raise them as a member of the opposite sex, and then natural puberty hits, and they have to go through their natal sex puberty. That would be, how could you do that? So social transition in the early days, it didn't happen. And we have all of the literature from that era shows that we're talking an average of about 80% of the children who had this childhood onset version of gender dysphoria. About 80% of them during or after puberty would desist, reconcile with their birth sex, and almost all of them ended up being homosexual adults, because we know that extreme gender nonconformity in childhood is a strong predictor of homosexuality in adulthood. So we're looking at about 80%. Let's just take that number. And then social transition comes along. And as soon as social transition comes along, and becomes more common, the desistance rates start to decline quite dramatically, to the point that the most recent study we have, where they looked at, I can't remember actually how many children, there were hundreds of children, and it was 5 years after social transition, and 97.5% were still identifying as transgender. So we've
Mm.
gone from 80% desistance rate to 2.5% desistance rate. And the difference is, well, to be honest, it's not just social transition, it's also medical intervention. It's also putting them on puberty blockers. Now, I'll give a quick, the puberty suppression experiment. It starts in the 1990s, the early 2000s, throughout the 2000s, it's very, very few children are being put on puberty blockers. And the idea at the time was that puberty blockers would be, not only were they fully reversible, meaning no harm done, it's a fully reversible intervention, but they also viewed them as a sort of diagnostic tool, in that you could put the child on the puberty blockers and then they would not be quite as distressed about the development of their sex characteristics. And so they'd be able to relax and really think about their gender
Mm.
and really think about whether medical transition was right for them. And they thought that puberty blockers would prevent the false positives, would be a better way of preventing and transitioning people who would later regret it. Again, like social transition, they
Mm.
didn't understand the process. They didn't understand the impact. What has happened with puberty blockers, and we saw this right from the very beginning. They noticed right at the beginning that almost all or almost all, 100% or like 98% of the kids put on blockers progressed to taking cross-sex hormones. Again, remember that 80% would desist without social and medical intervention. And so we're looking at 100% or 98% of kids progressing from puberty blockers to cross sex hormones. This should have been an enormous red flag. They should have said, hang on a minute, what's going on? Why this dramatic change? As it turns out, we now have a better understanding that puberty blockers don't just prevent the development of secondary sex characteristics, they freeze the child in time. They freeze the cognitive development. They freeze the
Oh, wow, I
sexual
had no idea.
development. Oh, they
Well,
freeze the child in time.